Hey everyone, we're back with another AskGN episode. This one has some really good questions in it, and I had to reach out actually to an expert in solid-state storage to answer one of the questions. So we have a quote from him addressing thermals and whether or not some of the cooling solutions for SSDs are complete bullshit. So that's something we're going to talk about today, something we've covered a bit in the past too. Lots of other good questions though. As always, leave your questions in the comment section below for consideration for the next time. We're shooting 3 today. This is the first of 3. The second one will also go live on the main channel within hopefully plus or minus 18 hours of this one. And then the third one is going on the Patreon Discord. Before that, this video is brought to you by NZXT's new H500 case, which we recently found to have an impressively effective cooling setup that is entirely negative pressure when stock. The H500 is the successor of the S340 and S340 Elite, offering high build quality that's all steel and glass, and cable management features that are also top class for this $70 compact mid-tower case. The H500 is a part of NZXT's new H-series lineup, which also features options for mini ITX, micro ATX, and full ATX builds. Learn more at the link in the description below. Very quick note first, this shirt, the teal logo version, the teal teardown logo, we just restocked it in tri-blend and cotton, and we have a few women's V-necks in stock as well. So trying to cover everyone there. And when I say a few, I mean it's like 8, but that should cover us for a little while. So if you wanted one of these design shirts, they are in stock on store.gamersnexus.net. They were out of stock for a few weeks. Thank you very much for supporting the design. It seems very popular. So the first question is from Ulams5, who says, why are you willing to answer a lawsuit question on Nvidia but not AMD? AMD heavily advertised primitive shaders and discard and HBCC for the Vega architecture. None of them have materialized in the current discrete Vega cards. I've been asking for months, but you refuse to touch this subject. Well, I mean, probably I didn't see the question, which is probably because your persecution complex was just so big that I couldn't see it past the persecution complex. Guys, first of all, we get tens of thousands of comments a week. So there's a giant difference between refusing to answer and literally not seeing it. And I did check, and I think you've asked this question twice, and both of those videos were really popular, so I didn't see it. Or if I did see it, I didn't feel qualified to talk about it at the time. It's one of those two things. So you kind of push that persecution issue you have to the side for a moment, maybe talk to someone about that. The thing is, regarding your actual question, that we've gotten that dealt with, the question of AMD's primitive shaders and discard and HBCC for Vega architecture not materializing in the current discrete cards. I would agree that primitive shader, discard, and drawstream, binning, rasterization, all that stuff, those core features, we actually did talk about them, first of all, in the Vega content. But yeah, I would agree that they didn't really fully materialize as we were hoping. Now, some of these features are on the driver side, some are on the game developers. So some of AMD's Vega features require game developer integration. One of the things you didn't mention here, what the hell was it called? It was, I can't remember their name for it, but it was the thing that moves to FP16. So it enabled FP16 processing when game developers would engage with that in order to rapid packed math. That was it, RPM, rapid packed math. So FP16 is another feature where it's just floating point 16. It's called half precision rather than single precision, which would be 32, FP32. So you're using fewer decimal points to calculate things, which is fine. You don't always need 32, FP32 for accuracy for something like a video game. It kind of depends on what you're calculating, but for a lot of things you can get away with FP16. So it was actually a good idea. It's just the problem is they're relying on game developers to use it. And so that's one of the big walls there to actual adoption. And when you're the smaller vendor of 2, as AMD is, anything that requires the rest of the world to conform to your thing and actually use it, even if it's a good thing like RPM, anything that requires people to leverage your specific technology, when you have less than 30% market share, that's obviously going to be an uphill battle. AMD has a lot of battles to fight. It's kind of a chicken or the egg thing. They have to be better to get more adoption, and they have to have more adoption to get better. So it's a really tough challenge for them, and I thought some of those features of Vega we're not going to see for that reason. Primitive shader discard is one of the ones that was more or less canned, and I don't have a great answer for why. We haven't talked about Vega cards since they came out, basically because they've never been in stock since. Or if they were in stock, the prices were insane. So I would advise you to look back through our Vega 56 and 64 content if you want Vega discussion. That was several months ago. I talked about it a whole lot then. As for lawsuits, I am not a legal expert. I will remind you, I frankly don't know enough about this specific situation to comment on it. So the question of why are you willing to answer one and not the other is because one was like more cut and dry to me as a non-lawyer, and I was able to speak to it. And also, I never saw your question the first few times. So anyway, whatever. Those are my thoughts on Vega. Hopefully some of the actual information there is useful for you. They had good ideas for it. It's just, it does kind of suck where, you know, some of the good ideas just aren't feasible to be used on a wide scale because it requires adoption and vice versa. So it is a very unique challenge, and AMD is in a hard spot for it. The next question is from Prayden, who says, it has been mentioned that M.2 NVMe heatsinks may cause degradation to the drives in some form. Would using an M.2 heatsink, such as the one from EKWB, mainly for aesthetic purposes, have an appreciable negative impact? What degrades, what processes are impacted, and how does it progress over time? Would it be safe to use them in a showpiece gaming system that is on and near idle most of the time? This is a very good question, and specifically what I like about it is that Prayden talks about the use cases. So it's not just a wide sweeping question of when and how should I use this thing, it's here's how I'm going to use this thing. And for your question, I approached Alan Malventano from PCPer. Alan Malventano is one of the leading storage reviewers in the space. I would, if you ever have SSD questions or you want to know how good an SSD is, I would point you towards his reviews first, as I think he's one of the forefront experts in reviewing SSDs, and he's from PCPer.com if you want to check them out. So Alan had a great answer, and this comes back to, before I read his answer, I think this question originates from something I've said a lot, where we've talked about that EKWB block for SSDs, and the problem is, you know, you really don't want to sync the NAND if you're going to be writing a whole lot. And that's because there is degradation, because NAND, the flash, actually prefers to be warmer while it's doing writes, and if you may have heard of cold storage. If you are storing it, then you want it to be cold, but if it's active, you want it to be warm. The controller, to a point, should be cooler so that it doesn't throttle, but a point of thermal throttle is rare to hit, which is something Alan talks about. So let me read you his answer here. Alan said, JEDEC rates, that's the group that rates these things, JEDEC rates client SSDs with an operating temperature of 40 degrees Celsius. If you force the flash down closer to room temperature, let's say 25°C, then with the same amount of writing done at that lower temperature, the end-of-life data retention time will be cut in half. An M.2 SSD without a heatsink will naturally rise above ambient. Same goes for SSDs with heat spreaders or heat spreading labels. You may have seen those. Some of the stickers are literally heat spreaders these days. And he further says that they just spread the heat more evenly, which is actually better for endurance since the flash will also run slightly warmer even while idle. Now for the heatsink and water block problem, the goal of these items is to prevent thermal throttling during heavy use, but that is a controller issue, not a flash issue. Flash loves to be hot while operating, specifically during writes, as that is what causes the wear. Where the heatsink and block makers get this wrong is by having the thermal pad contact on the flash. We want it to only contact the controller. Yes, the overall temperature will still run lower, less controller heat conducting to the flash while idle, but at least during heavy writes, the flash will be able to rise closer to its preferred temperature without the heatsink actively pulling it back down to ambient. This is far less of a concern for a showpiece system that is rarely writing, but I would still recommend trimming the thermal pad so that it only contacts the controller. So that is from Alan Malventano at PCPer. I had a bit more of a discussion with him. He gave me a chart that hopefully we can put on the screen at some point during this with some temperatures, power off, and active temperatures that you can look at. And also we talked about overall personal takes on these heatsink devices for M.2 SSDs. And Alan noted that generally throttling is the only reason to actively cool the SSD on the controller, that is. And thermal throttling on the controller is pretty hard to do, except in benchmarks that might not be realistic. So if you know you're throttling, then it's useful. But if not, it might not be worth buying. And things like the labels that are built in, the heat spreading labels, the built-in heat sinks on some devices like Plextor has had, those can do an okay job in some instances. And the main thing is just, maybe consider trimming the thermal pad like Alan was saying. So I think, we had one more thing we talked about here that I want to bring up. A great way to deal with a controller overheating in rare cases. Like if you only occasionally hit throttle points on the SSD controller, a great thing to do is put some thermal pads between the controller and the motherboard if it's dual-sided, or even just on the back side of the PCB of the SSD and the motherboard, because the motherboard's a natural heat sink. It is made of fiberglass and copper, basically. So you put a thermal pad between the controller and the board, whether it's the back side or the front side, that'll sink some heat, and it's going to be targeted. It won't cool the NAND, so you don't have to worry about that at all. Also, average case temperature, it tends to be about upper 30s, 35, 40 C in an environment that's 25 C. So just some more information for you. Next one is from Bitter Cynic, who says, AskGN, is AMD still losing in the long term because of how irrelevant their progress might be due to the mainstream users due to GPU and RAM prices? Personally, I'm disappointed with how the potential of Ryzen and Vega ended up squandered instead of being picked up by a large portion of gamers, forcing the prices of both old and new Intel and Nvidia parts to drop. First, on GPU and RAM prices, yes, that was it was unfortunate timing for GPU and RAM. It started going up right around when Ryzen was coming out, if I remember correctly, and when you have a large surge of people building new systems in the market, as Ryzen prompted, because it's pretty good architecture for first launch, actually very good for first launch of like a brand new architecture. And so there's going to be an influx, a lot of system builders, and to have GPU and RAM prices skyrocket at that exact moment, it's very unfortunate timing. So yeah, I would say that's unfortunate. Now, as far as is AMD losing in the long term, I'm not going to speak to the financial side of this. I can talk a bit to the technological side. I'm not a financial expert. I'm not going to pretend. So AMD isn't out of the woods yet. They had years of being basically non-existent in the enthusiast desktop CPU market. And I think that's pretty agreeable for most people. It was really small market share for FX, especially with bulldozers. Very disappointing launch. Phenom 2 was a fantastic architecture. Phenom 2 X6, or whatever that ARC was called. Phenom 2 X6 was a really good processor. Bulldozer was pretty disappointing. They released a lot of refreshes with the FX line. Some of them were better than others. And it took time. It took, 5 years for AMD to get to a point where they could push something like Ryzen and show significant gains. So it's going to take time to recover market share. And so far, anecdotally, mind you, we've seen our audience just with affiliate sales, because we can see affiliate revenue distribution via our Amazon, Newegg, other retailer partnerships. So this is anecdotally to our channel. To our channel, which I believe is primarily comprised of gamers, or people who do like to game occasionally at least. For our channel, we've seen greater AMD adoption than we've seen ever in the last 6 years. And I think we've had affiliate accounts with these companies for probably 6 to 8 years. So basically since we started doing affiliate tracking and revenue. So we've seen more referred sales to things, and part of this is going to be confirmation bias, because the parts we recommend will tend to be purchased more frequently. So, it's not a great set of data if you're trying to analyze the market. But it's good enough for me to look at our audience and say, what are you all buying? And the answer is a lot more Ryzen than any time for AMD in the past we've ever seen ever with the FX CPUs or the previous APUs before Raven Ridge. So I would say that AMD, although they are not out of the woods yet, they have a ton of ground to gain, still kind of struggling in the GPU market. The CPU side of AMD has oddly kind of flipped with the GPU side, where suddenly the CPU side's the strong department, and it's gaining a lot of ground. And I think AMD has a chance here to claw back. Their semi-custom group is also doing very well. So semi-custom designs, it's the group that did the Xbox and PlayStation and stuff like that. AMD's also working with China-based companies now for that Diana CPU, which is basically a China-only release with a Zen architecture x86 processor. So I would say overall AMD is doing okay, but the GPU side's very weak. Driver side's not great on the GPUs. It has improved. The AMD Red Team Plus people are going to freak out and post a comment because they'll get points and a free shirt if they do. But the fact of the matter is that the driver side for AMD, especially on the professional side, where they will sometimes encourage professional users of Radeon cards to use gaming drivers because they are more up to date than the professional drivers, it's a problem. That side, I think, has the most to gain right now, and I'm not sure what's going on in the Radeon Technologies group, but hopefully they can gain some ground back there. So Ryzen, I think, is doing well. I think it's carrying the team right now, and AMD's gaining ground with it. Threadripper 2 should be very interesting to look at. This is where right now AMD hasn't gained as much server market share as you might expect with EPYC, but enterprise users, server users want something that's tested. EPYC's been out a while now. Threadripper's been out a while now for workstation users. So as these second generations roll out, I would expect to see more of an uptick in their market share than previously, just because it has been tested. So the second generation is something that should have some more eyes on it than previously, if anyone was either concerned that it wasn't battle tested or tried in a tough environment, or they just didn't have their eyes on it because it's AMD and AMD didn't have anything impressive up until that point. So are they still losing in the long term? I can't answer that question, but I would say that AMD is doing better in the CPU department, at least for our audience, for our affiliate revenue we can track, than we've ever seen for AMD CPU sales. GPU sales are down, and I would imagine part of that's due to mining, part of that's because they can't get the prices to MSRP, which is a memory price issue as well. So that's a big problem. GPU, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. AMD has to do a lot here. They still have a tremendous amount of debt, but they're doing the right things on at least one side of their business. So let's hope they can do that on the GPU side as well, maybe with Navi. And Vega 56 is a good card, by the way. It's just the price is too high most of the time. Next question. Jay Bryan says, have you guys looked into the possibility of visualizing airflow through cases? So I'm going to stop here. Yes, we did in one of our previous AskGNs. If you maybe try Google searching for, like, I don't remember the episode number. Try just AskGN smoke test and see what comes up. The short of it is we've done it. We've even published some of it. It was ages ago. We did plumber smoke pellets. So you light them on fire and it makes a bunch of smoke. And the reason I did that was because it didn't have any moisture in it, no water vapor. So we didn't have that conduction concern. Problem is, for components, they'll get kind of slimy and gross if you use water vapor. There's a concern maybe of shorting something. And we've talked to some companies about some special solutions for that. And right now it's not feasible, but it's something we'll continue to look into as we get more space to work with and budget and stuff like that. The problem is just that it doesn't show you quite as much as we would all like it to show you with the method that we had previously, which was the safest. Also, the method we had previously left the system smelling awful. So you had to test it outside, and then all the parts would smell like smoke for weeks. So anyway, yeah, something we've looked into, we've done even, and hopefully one day we can do more. Rusty Shackleford said, Steve, I couldn't help but notice on the back of my motherboard box it says they're using superior Japanese capacitors. Is this because they are quality capacitors from their respective company or just an odd marketing tactic? It's actually really common for companies to boast about Japanese caps, and that's because the origin of it is that some of the SMD manufacturers in Japan make some really high quality SMDs, capacitors being one of those. So the thing I wasn't sure about is one would assume that any country is capable of housing companies that are both good and bad at making something. So I would have to assume there's a bad specific Japanese capacitor model out there somewhere. I think that would be reasonable to assume. So I don't know that just being a Japanese capacitor is inherently makes you the best, but I did speak with BuildZoid, who knows quite a lot about VRM components and capacitors and things like that. And BuildZoid noted to me that he's not immediately aware of any Japanese capacitors on motherboards that are bad. So I guess there is actually some truth to that marketing, despite being marketing. From what I understand from BuildZoid, it sounds like, generally speaking, it's pretty safe to assume that they're going to be better than average in the very least, if not just outright good. Next question is from, and that just comes down to who's manufacturing stuff, and Japan happens to have a lot of small electronics manufacturers, including Omron, actually, which we should tour at some point. The next question is from Jeff Lima. He says, hey, Steve, I just saw an older video you made about Rockit Cool's copper IHS for the 1151 socket, how you tested it with Conductonaut. Got me thinking of how copper reacts with liquid metal in a bad way. Have you had any bad experiences with it? Some reports say the reaction is only happening above 80 degrees Celsius. So, first of all, between the die and the standard IHS, the normal Intel IHS, that's nickel plated, so you're not going to have any really problems there, any reactions that are of a meaningful impact, anything. As far as the Rockit Cool one, so you'll get some tarnishing on it. The liquid metal will basically, I don't know what the correct chemical process is that's happening there, but basically if you look at the underside of the IHS after you apply some, it'll stain it. So it stains it the color of liquid metal. In our testing, we've done a lot of it, it doesn't impact thermals in any meaningful way. So even though you have that layer of old liquid metal there, the thermal performance is functionally the same. It's within our margin of error, whatever the difference is. So I wouldn't worry about it. The only thing to worry about is definitely don't use liquid metal with aluminum. It will not like it. You'll get pitting and damage to the aluminum. It's pretty bad. But it's okay to use with copper. It will stain it. But from our testing, the stains don't seem to impact thermal performance, and that's being people who replace the liquid metal on these things more than most average users ever would in the lifetime of the system. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. It is possible for liquid metal to have a bad chemical reaction with some materials, but they are all labeled on the card that you get with the liquid metal, so just read that. It's typically just aluminum, but nickel plated, you're totally fine. Copper, just be prepared for some tarnishing, visual tarnishing. Performance doesn't seem to be impacted in our testing. Pitting, you have to worry about a bit, but that's more of using it with improper materials or incompatible materials, which will be listed on the instructions, hopefully. Next one of two more, I think, is from Nelson Penna, who says, question, what are the things you've noticed that get harder or easier as the size of your channel increases? And do you think it's the same for other channels or other types of channels? I'm going to keep this kind of short. Easier, learning how to produce content and learning how to learn. Just like anything else, as you get better at something, you kind of figure out how you get better at that thing. So learning how to learn is the absolute biggest asset for us as we continue to grow and do more things. That makes us more efficient at things. It makes me better at talking to contacts and researching stuff. Helps us understand when should we take something, research it, test it, and decipher it, versus when should we just talk to someone who's an expert and get their information. Because sometimes, if better work exists, you really don't need to add to it if you think you can't do a better job than them. It's always good to have more data. It's always good to do more work on a subject. But honestly, time is the biggest resource we have that we can't get more of. And aside from paying more people, but it's not a linear scaling with the way YouTube works. So time is the biggest thing we can't get more of, and sometimes it's better to just refer to an expert on the subject, and that will allow us more time to work on something else. So learning how to do stuff like that's really important. And I would say access to companies has gotten easier. What's harder, keeping up the pace is hard. I'm gonna do it, damn it, but it's really difficult sometimes. The hours are long, you get tired, the travel is nonstop for, I don't know, 8 months out of the year. So that gets harder, and that keeps getting harder because there's more travel as more people want to bring us or to events or talk to us. So it's stuff we can handle, but I would say keeping up the pace is the most difficult. It's something I can do though. Next thing is the signal to noise ratio and comments, and this is where like the Patreon Discord community has been great because it's a smaller group of people. So it's easier for me to keep a pulse on that than YouTube comments, where we start getting worse signal to noise as more people come in who are maybe less mature, I'll say, than our core audience, all of you watching. Because the problem is, it's not the subscriber base. It's people who aren't subscribed, who've never seen us, who come in through the side channel from another channel that might target a younger audience or something. And rather than just leave if they don't like the content, they'll start posting comments that are trolling or attacking other users personally. And that's not cool. And there's not a lot we can do about it either, unfortunately. Last one is actually not a question, but it was a great comment, and I really wanted to read it to give it the attention it deserved. This is from LO1, or LOL, who said, off topic for memes, this is from the episode where I talked about how we don't go to parties at events because they're a waste of time. LOL says, I wonder what Noctua Computex parties are like. Classical music. People walking around drinking 90% purified water, very quiet. And Noctua engineers showing off their fancy stuff. Silent auctions of various Noctua products, party games, fan airflow testing, extreme overclocking with the NHD15, case mods with Noctua engineers. No, that acrylic triangle will not be enough to hold up the SSD. Here's a machined aluminum SSD mount rated for 3 kilograms of load. Just made it with my portable laser cutter. Steve's hair cooling mount revisited with resin 3D printers. And the end is Noctua engineers blowing you out of the room with a wall of NFA 12 by 25s. So just wanted to read that one for everyone for a good ending. As always, you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to get access to the bonus episode. On the main channel, we'll have a second episode, whether before or after this one. And also go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up one of these shirts. We just restocked the teal teardown logo. And of course, we still have the mod mats in stock, or we're actually coming into stock as I speak right now. And I think that covers it. So subscribe for more. Leave a question in the comments if you have one. Thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time.